So now you are going to use SQL as a backend to store the data, right? So again, MySQL is free to download and use. So it is a database system that runs on a server, right? So whenever we use PHP and SQL, we have an app. Exam is a popular app. It's open source, again freeware for connecting PHP code with a backend server. So it has an inbuilt database server inside it, and you'll be able to execute the code using an exam app, right? So now we'll study how to write a code to connect to a backend database, right? So before we access the data in a SQL database, we need to connect to the server. So generally in PHP, first we need to check for establish a connection, right? So establishing the connection involves specifying the server name, username, and password, right? So once you create a new connection, you need to specify the server name, which may be a local host if the server is present in the same machine, your username and password corresponding to the database, right? So you need to establish a connection. You need to check whether the connection works properly. Else you need to handle it by an exception that the connection is failed, and you need to get out of this script. You need to display the message that connection is failed. There is a connect error, and come out of the script. Else you need to print the message connected successfully, right? Right. So it is possible to create a table in PHP. So again, you need to specify the server name, username, password, database name, and so on. So you need to establish a connection using this function, new MySQLi, with the input argument server name, username, password, and database name. You need to check the connection, right? So for any connectivity between a middleware language and the backend database, you need to establish a connection. You need to check whether the connection works properly. If the connection is not established, you need to display connect error. $SQL, you'll be writing the SQL query. Here you are expected to create an SQL query, my guest, which contains the first name, last name, email ID, right? The ID of the guest, first name, last name, email ID, and registration date, which contains the timestamp, right? So you are going to execute the SQL query through the connection, and you are expected to print whether the tables are created successfully or you have an error in establishing a connection, right? So this is how you create a table in PHP. So we are interested in inserting records into SQL backend SQL database by means of PHP, right? So again, it contains the variables to store the server name, username, password, database name, and so on. So the first step, again, in any server-side scripting language, is that you are expected to establish a connection. You need to check whether the connection works properly, right? Then you use this $SQL to as a variable to assign the SQL query, right? So we are going to insert into the table my guest. You are going to insert the values like first name, name of the guest, last name, email ID, and so on, right? Then you are going to execute the SQL query through the connection, and if the new record is added into the database, it it prints a message that the new record is created successfully. Else it gives you a message that there is an connection error, and finally you are expected to close the connection at the end of this scripting language, right? So similarly, this lab class, you can create some HTML form. So I hope It's very simple to create HTML forms, and you can use a scripting language like PHP to get the data from the form elements, and you can store it in the backend database, right? So I think, as I said, that we have an exam app which can be, we have a lot of apps available. Exam, I think, is a popular app. It's a freeware open source app for establishing a connection between the scripting language and the backend database. So you have an web server, you have an Apache web server, you have folders for storing HTML files separately, folders for storing scripting languages separately, and it also have an option to create databases, right? So you can get the values from the form elements, and you can try to insert records into the backend database. So you can work with both insertion of records into the backend database. You can also work with displaying the records that are present in your database, and maybe updating the records in your backend database, right? So you can create a simple online reservation system, right? Like a railway reservation system. You can create a simple form where you are expected to get the username, like passenger name, maybe passenger age, a source, station, and destination station. You are going to get the information from the form elements, right? So you are going to read it using a dollar underscore post variable name. You are going to get the value of the variables, and you are going to store it into a backend database, right? So any server-side scripting language, it's going to be quite simple. You need to establish a connection. To establish a connection, you need to give the server name, username, password, and database name. So you need to establish the connection. You need to check whether the connection is established perfectly, else you display an error message. So the next step, once the connection is established, is that you are going to assign an SQL statement to a PHP variable, right? So here $SQL is a variable where you are going to assign the SQL statement that has to be executed, right? Then you are going to execute the SQL query over the connection that is being established, and you are going to display a success message or a record inserted message. If the record is inserted into the backend database, else display an error message. So you are expected to have some exceptional handlers during establishing a connection, as well as inserting of records into a backend database, and finally closing the connection once the SQL queries are executed successfully.